Beena, how are you?
Good, Corey. It's great to be here, especially after having talked about it for a while. So
I know. We've been talking for months about what the next series of shows. Our problem, Beena, is every time you and I get on the phone together, there's just this eruption of ideas. And there's always like a dozen things we want to do, and then we have time to execute like one and a half of them. So we always have to play a little bit of triage to figure out how to prioritize it. But that's one of the things I love about working with you, is that there's just so much ground to cover. And whenever you and I hop on to do one of these things together, we're always discussing just some of my favorite subjects. And in this case, polarity thinking is
and mine, and
yeah,
mine, and mine too. And that's a good problem to have so many ideas, and in some ways they all interconnect, right? They
that's
intersect,
right.
and
That's right.
polarity will show up everywhere. So it's my most exciting topic.
And that has been my experience, is that it really shows up absolutely everywhere. I mean, Ken often talks about how integral theory itself, he uses the word psychoactive to describe learning integral theory, where it's like once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you're not getting it back in. And polarity thinking, it's the exact same thing. It's like once you learn sort of the basics of how to manage and integrate polarities, you start seeing them everywhere. And one of the things I was talking to you about, I was chatting with you about earlier, is for me personally, how it's landed is it's helped me so much, not only with my sort of interior intra-personal development and awakening and just sort of navigating my way through some of these patterns and tendencies and all that, but also epistemically. I mean, when I look out at the world and I try to make sense of the world around me, polarity thinking has been absolutely invaluable, because it helps us get through our own biases and our own sort of presuppositions and whatever judgments, fully formed judgments, we're walking into a conversation with. And it's helping us recognize what's in our blind spot, what are we missing, what's valuable about the other perspective. And it's not a perspective that you need to agree with or even disagree with at the end of the day. But if you're not actually working to integrate sort of the deep features of that polarity, of that coming from that opposite pole, then you're probably missing something really, really important. So all of which is just to say, this work has been tremendously beneficial for me personally, and it's come into a lot of the shows that we've been doing ever since we launched this course. And I thank you for bringing this to us, to the integral audience. It's been such a great ride.
Yeah, of course. I couldn't agree with you more. It is a tool for seeing, and seeing is relieving. So it helps us to see more completely. And we all have our lenses, we all have our biases, we all have our biases, we all have our preferences. And I think it's a great tool to begin to see what is unconscious also. It helps you open the doors to see the things that you couldn't see. And then you wonder, well, why didn't I see that before? And then you realize that there was an unconscious bias or an unconscious filter. And that's why this tool is developmental, and it's fundamentally integral, or rather it's fundamentally teaches us how to be integral. And it's applicable all the way up, all the way down. There's a big relationship between polarity thinking and developmental thinking, or the levels of maturity. So how to be more integral, how to climb the ladder of development, involves how to integrate that which we have rejected. So it's just a beautiful integrator. And I think that's I think a more enlightened perspective is an outcome usually of more integration.
Yeah, no, beautifully said. I kind of think of it almost like it's one of these sort of technologies of consciousness, this interior technologies. It's a fairly simple sort of mechanic that we use in all sorts of facets of our lives. You're talking about sort of how it can help us with growth and development. This also helps us with the waking up path, right? This helps us with, as you just said, cleaning up. I mean, to reclaim some of our hidden shadows, and again, the biases and the presuppositions that we walk around with. It helps us reclaim and reintegrate so much of that. And then finally, it helps us to show up more fully in this world and to be more skillful and to have the capacity to engage with people on a much deeper level where, really everyone, it becomes easier to see how everyone kind of has a place and everyone can fit into a larger conversation, whatever that conversation happens to be. I mean, these days we're talking a lot about gun violence in the wake of the Rittenhouse verdict, for example. Polarity thinking helps me navigate that, helps me navigate the political divides that I see out there, as much as sort of the tensions that I feel, within myself, within my own mind and my own heart. So it's just been, it's precious. It reminds me of, Ken often talked about how Robert Keegan's framing of subject becomes object is this really simple technology that can be used, again, for all these different facets of our being. And polarity thinking it's something very similar to me.
Yeah, and I think polarity thinking does the opposite as well, is enabling object becoming an integrated subject. The things that we push away, the thing that we don't see, helps us to integrate into a new level of integrated subject, which is actually developmental.
Yeah.
And so even making subject object is only one pole.
Right.
And that's a polarity, making subject object and making object subject. And if you miss the other pole, you're missing half of development.
That's right. Beautifully said. I mean, because that's shadow work, right? I mean, you're supposed to go 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3. You got to push it out, pull it back in. You need that. It's almost like breath work in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, beautiful. All the more reason I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. So let's talk to our audience about what we're going to be doing. So we are designing this segment to be as interactive as possible. These shows are always so much better when we get to talk to you at home. I mean, Beena, you and I can hop on the phone and talk to each other whenever we want. We, having the opportunity to actually talk with our audience, I think, is a really cool and special thing. So I'm hoping
we already have a question.
We already have a question. So should we start just like jump off with a question, or do you want to give some kind of, opening salvo here?
I'm actually curious to see how many people on the call are familiar with polarities, because we use the word, and if you don't understand the way we are using it, in some ways we are codifying it in a particular way. And so if there are people who this is new to, I think it would help to give a little introduction. But if everybody here is familiar, then we can just jump into some questions.
Yeah.
Is there a way of checking?
I could, if maybe if you make a couple comments to begin with, while you do that, I can create a quick poll that people can take right here in Zoom to let us know.
Yeah, that would be great. And I can see some chat messages. So Anne says, she's taken the course. So yeah, if those who are familiar, you can also put in the chat message and respond to Corey's poll. And what I'll do is take this question from Paul.
Great.
So Paul's question is, I'm very interested in the role, function, and importance of paying attention to the feeling, sensing of the body while working with polarities. And I can't help but notice that you are looking at working with polarities as a mental function, and then you are highlighting the other pole, which is, where does the body come in? What's the importance? And what is the role and the function? So you're already naming in some ways the pole that you feel is missing from the way we work with polarities. And that is showing polarity thinking. So yes, in order to really integrate the working with polarities, we need to be able to sense and feel and use our body, as well as use our mind and use our thinking. Often when I'm teaching and we're working with a polarity, I will draw a quadrant map on the floor, simply, line up a piece of tape vertically and then across horizontally. And then when we're working with the polarity, people will walk through the 4 quadrants that arise from the 2 poles that we're discussing. And then we actually ask questions that help them to sense into the body. What are they feeling? Which part of the body are they feeling in? And which of these quadrants they feel more body in? Which of the quadrants, do you actually feel you're not paying attention to your body? And so there's so many different ways you can integrate. But thanks for the question, and thanks for bringing the body in, because if you're just doing it with your head and doing it conceptually, then you haven't integrated it. If you don't bring the body in, you haven't integrated it. So that would be my quick response. Corey, do you have any other thoughts?
No, just that was a fantastic question, and I do think it's I do a show with Ryan Oki called Inhabit, and the purpose of the show is to basically help answer questions exactly like this, because it's so easy when we're doing integral anything, whether it's polarity work or integral aqual kind of thinking and analyses. It's very easy for it to be sort of neck up. You know what I mean? It's especially since we are this integral movement, quote unquote, is unfolding on these, disembodied social media platforms where all we sort of have to experience each other is these little sort of text windows. So it's easy for this stuff to get disembodied really, really quickly, which is why I was glad that the first question that we answered was actually about embodiment, actually pulling this material into, not just our heads, but into our hearts and into our bones, so that we can, really, again, just embody this material as fully and as skillfully as we can.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight another aspect of embodying is actually experiential. So we can think about it, we can understand it well, we can interpret, we can name, we can articulate. And if we don't notice how it's showing up in our experience, if we are not able to connect how it's showing up in the other person's experience, then that's another polarity, which is thinking and experiential, that I think is an important aspect of integrating polarities, which is different from embodying. And I think it's an important thing to include. I see a comment, a request from Patricia to do a brief intro to establish a mutual agreement about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that sounds good. And so I just put out the poll. Let's see here. We've had 22 people answer. It looks like 16 of you guys are already familiar with polarity thinking. And for 6 of you, this is somewhat new. So we've got a bit of a mix here.
Okay, great. So let's do a very quick intro. Hopefully it'll be a refresher for those of you who are already familiar. So what I'm going to have you do is actually respond in the chat message as a way to trigger your thinking and for me to be able to respond and use what you're saying as examples. I'm going to have you respond to 2, what I call sentence stems, for you to just complete the sentence. So I want you to first complete the sentence. The thing I like about myself is, just complete that sentence. And it could be 3 or 4 things, or you could say the things I like about myself, or the thing I like about myself. So just please complete honesty. Okay, just complete that. The thing I like about myself. I'm curious. And Corey, feel free to put yours too. You're cool. Greg is cool. The thing I like about myself. Okay. Inquiry, perspective. You're a seeker. Beautiful. Passion about learning, sensitivity. Okay, great. Thank you. Thinking systemically. Okay, so those who haven't written, please put yours in. I'll give you another 10 seconds. David is open. Warm, heart, caring. Wonderful. So what I'd like you to do now is think about, actually, I have another stem, but I feel like following what I'm seeing here and have you do the next piece, which is when I am, whatever I like about myself, when I'm ingenious, open, curious, sensitive, then I suffer from. Actually, let me rephrase that slightly. When I'm too open, too ingenious, too sensitive, too honest, too patient, too curious, and trying to seek too much, I suffer from what? What's the downside? So I'd like you to complete that sentence. And no focus. So I have to go back to see what Anne started with. Yeah, curiosity. If I'm too curious, then I lose focus. I lose directionality, I lose follow through, I get lost in complexity, I feel overwhelmed. Wonderful. Focus is hard. Yes, when you seek too much, David, you suffer from losing contact with the perfection of the world. Beautiful. So you recognize already you are in this experience of privileging something that you love. And when you do too much of it, then you land in these places that are not great. And if we love something, we will do more because we think doing more is better. Yeah, overly involved, too tolerant. Yeah. Okay. So now I'd like you to complete another sentence stem, which sort of naturally flows from this, is that when I'm overly involved, when I'm overwhelmed, when focus is hard, when I get lost in complexity, I'm now using your words, when I'm indecisive, when I'm paralyzed, when I have no focus, what I would like, what I really need, or what I would like, or what I really need is what? Complete that. Like Edward says, when I'm too tolerant, I may sacrifice my own needs. So what I really need is to focus on myself because I'm too tolerant of other people. So what is it that you need? Something concrete. What would, when you're too, like you're overly curious, you lose focus. So what you need is focus. So in some ways, you're describing what is missing. You need to focus, you need to be humble, you need to take a decision. Spaciousness. Yeah, David. Otherwise, you're seeking. You lose contact with what is. You want a simple walk in nature to get connected. Great. Thank you. Now I want you to complete the last part, which is what happens if you did too much of this thing that you just need? If you did too much of spaciousness and too much of walking in nature, or too much of focus, too much of decision making, what do you worry about? What is something that might happen? So there is another downside that you want to avoid. You don't want to go to the other side because you worry. So in David, your case, it could be, if I spend too much time in nature, I'm too focused on perfection, then I lose direction. Then I feel I'm not getting anywhere. I'm stagnant. And so then you want to go back to seeking, perhaps. Yeah, notice. And what I want you to do is feel this fear. Feel this place that you don't want to be. You become too egoistic. You're not engaged in the world. Yes. Missing important perspectives. And therefore, each of these fears, places you don't want to be, will naturally push you to what you love about yourself. So this is a little simple cycle. I'm going to share my screen and right now, and then give you my example. Yeah, I want you to feel this dynamic as you've been following the 4 very simple questions, very simple triggers. And I'm going to give you an example of mine. So you can see my screen, Corey. I assume everybody can see my screen. So in my case, what if I start with number 1, what I love about myself is I like to make a difference. I like to have a voice. I want to grow. I want to develop. I want to influence. And I, of course, end up doing a lot of it. And I end up dominating in a conversation or when we are in a group, because I'm so committed to having my voice spoken, I end up dominating. And that's not a great place for me to be. And I often can hear people saying, hey, you know, we had 30 minutes. You were supposed to speak for 10 and you took 20. This happens quite easily, even though I'm working on it. I'm aware of it. But it's just that the passion is so, you know, intense. And so I realize, and I get this feedback that I need to be listening. I need to be pausing. I need to be more receptive. And so I start doing that, but very quickly I worry. If I did too much of that, then I worry that I would lose my voice. I'm ineffective. I'm ineffectual. And that's the worst place for me to be if I love making a difference and I love having a voice. And I hate that. So that's going to drive me back into speaking out. And then that cycle continues. So as you have seen in just your quick examples, this is a dynamic. You can see there are 2 things in tension in my case. On one side, I'd like to be assertive. And there are many ways to describe this. I'm just choosing to describe it in this way. I want to be assertive and I value that and I have something to say. And on the other side, I need to be more receptive because I tend to dominate, I tend to exclude. And unless I harmonize these 2, unless I integrate, I'm actually not going to be very effective. Because you can imagine if I end up dominating, what happens? People stop listening to me, right? People will think, well, she goes on and on. And so now they've switched off. And it's exactly the thing that I wanted I'm losing, which is I'm losing my voice regardless. And I find this fascinating that if we pursue the very thing we love, then we lose the very benefits we pursue that for. And you can apply it into each of your own each of your examples that you came up with. If you're trying to seek, you lose contact with what is, then you want to go and stay with what is, but then you worry that you're not contributing and you don't want to do that. And so you come back to seeking to make a difference. A little bit similar, but described slightly differently, David's and my example. So this is the dynamic. These two things, we call them poles, and they need each other. If I'm just assertive, it's not enough because I will be neglecting receptive and I'll end up dominating. If I'm only receptive and not assertive, then I don't have a voice, and that doesn't work. So a polarity, it means there are two values, two things that are needed, both needed to harmonize over time. And choosing one over the other will always end up in a dysfunctionality. Now, often, we've learned this throughout our lives. We won't completely neglect the other, but we privilege one. And if you privilege one, you will experience the downside. That's also a principle. So the way this dynamic simply works is we move towards something because we love that. You love to seek, you're curious, you love big perspectives, you want to be sensitive. For various reasons, that has passion for you and that has charge for you. And so you do more and more of that, and that you hit the limit of that and you end up in the downside of that. And you sit and tolerate it and tolerate it and tolerate it because this either or mindset that we have tells us, oh, in my case, I'm not dominating, I'm just making a difference. You see how we interpret that. And then before long, it becomes unsustainable. Sometimes it may take months, it may take years, sometimes shorter. And then we realize we have no choice but to go to the other side, because it just doesn't work anymore, especially in relationship. And we're sitting there doing this other thing that we want to do, but very quickly we are feeling the loss of what we left behind. If I'm listening, but where is my voice? And then I quickly end up in this downside. This doesn't feel good to me. And I'm missing what I really love and what I care about. And so very quickly I go back and feel that that's exactly what I should be doing because that is me. So in some ways we define ourselves, our identity gets caught up with these preferences that we have. And then we can lose sight of what the other pole is that will demand its attention. It will demand its pound of flesh over time. And so it's wise to recognize that it's there, to notice it, to name it, and then to be proactively and intentionally integrating it so that we are more balanced. I don't like the word balance because that has other connotations, but it's a simple word to use so that we end up not overdoing one or the other. So this is, so Patricia, this is the basic introduction to what a polarity is. And they show up everywhere. Like Corey said, once you begin to see it, you see them everywhere.
And real briefly, Beena, while you still have that graphic up, because right now we're looking at a graphic with 4 boxes on a screen. And of course, there's another famous integral graphic that features 4 boxes. So one of the questions we got in the community is the use of the 4 quadrants in this integrating polarities model aligned to the interior, exterior, individual, collective 4-quadrant matrix? So we're using quadrants, but we're using them in a slightly different way. So I just want to make clear for folks that this graphic is not Ken Wilber's version of the 4 quadrants. However, notice that in Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, those are themselves composed of polarities.
2 polarities, yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, most of integral theory comes down to polarity. So you've got obviously individual, collective, interior, exterior, you've got part and whole, you've got form and emptiness, temporal, atemporal, etc. And what I've noticed, Beena, is oftentimes when I'm doing polarity work myself, I've noticed how some of the polarities that I wrestle with often integrate up to some of these kind of fundamental integral polarities. Like this one right here, assertive and receptive, I can kind of enact it as almost a fractalization of like agency and communion, for example.
Or self and other. So there are some what I call root polarity. So self and other will show up in like a million ways. And here assertive could be I'm focusing more on myself and my voice, and receptive I'm focusing on your voice. So self and other is sort of a fundamental root polarity as a function of being a human being in relationship with another. Yeah. Yeah, and if you look at this particular polarity, you see 4 quadrants. So the 4 quadrants in connection with a polarity are the upsides of both, and then the downsides when you neglect one and overfocus on the other. And in the integral quadrants, you have the individual collective, the interior exterior superimposed on each other, and they are a much more multi-layered, textured quadrants that again, the polarities that Ken chose are fundamental to just our existence as a human being. It covers all, you put those 2 polarities together, it covers all the bases, all the bases of being a human being. So those would be the integral core polarities. And that's great. And I do, in my experience, it has been, you can be a master at integral, you can be a master at those 4 quadrants and still be mismanaging all kinds of polarities because you haven't seen them, you haven't named them. And that's where I find that what polarity thinking does is it trains you in noticing and integrating polarities. And basically that's what Ken did. He saw all the various schools of endeavor in different fields of inquiry. And he began to see how different schools in a particular field focused on one pole. And then newer schools emerged in contrast, in competition, in resistance, and focused on another pole, and each claiming we are right. And what Ken saw was they're both right. They're both partial and they're both right. And that's the fundamental principle that follows all polarities. They're both equally important. They're both necessary. They're both partial. Neither is true just by itself. And they both need each other over time.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah, that's why I often say this is the kind of thinking that produces things like integral maps in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. So I have a couple more slides, which I'll share later if there's a question around developmental stages, but I'm going to stop sharing so that you have a good basic introduction. And then we could look at some questions or see. Actually, at this time, I would love to listen to those of you who answered the stems. You know, what I love about myself, when I do too much of that, how do I suffer? So did you follow this cycle in your own example, and what insights did you get? So if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat message, that would be great.
Or you can hit the raise my hand button and we can actually let you talk.
Yeah, that would be good too.
Paul, I'm bringing you on over, buddy. There we go. Hey, Paul.
Yeah, hi, Paul.
Hi there.
No, I was
Hi.
referring to
Yeah, listen, my question is, I did your questioning, and I noticed in myself the tendency to go from 1 to 2, but then not go to 3 and 4. So when I hit number 2, like in your example, when there is like authority or people stop listening, I tend to make room for that. So not go really to 3 or 4, but I seem to want to stay within the 1 and 2 polarity and make room for those. So I don't seem to complete the circle 1, 2, 3, 4.
well, but is there an imperative to go to number 3? Is there a natural one? Then maybe number 2 is not a negative place for you. What is number 2 like for you?
So the tension I feel in number 2, like when I don't seem to be able to express myself, or I don't seem to be able to hear my voice, have my voice heard, that tension then seems for me to be the invitation to stay with that tension. So not so much to find a solution for that, but to integrate that friction, as it were, to make space for that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's another way of you countering number 1, where you want to make your voice heard, and now that's you're sort of disidentifying with that, and it's not becoming an imperative, which means number 2, you're not in a downside. So in some ways, you're already managing the polarity of I want my voice heard, and it's okay for my voice not to be heard.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You're actually moving to that. So that is the polarity. So that your number 3 is, can I be okay with this?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So,
cool.
yeah.
Love that. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Paul.
and there might be, so just what I would want you to watch out for is, when does it feel it's no longer okay for me? There might be a time when it doesn't serve you, because you'll keep expanding, you'll keep integrating that, and then you'll fall quiet, and then you may end up one day feeling like, I'm not influencing anything, that there's no energy to make any change. And if you feel that that's uncomfortable for you, then you would want to claim your voice. Then ideally, integrating the polarity means, how can I claim my voice fully? And how can I disappear my voice fully? That would feel like integration, where you can do both.
Yeah, and that's why my first question came up initially about the body. So I tend to then make space into my body to kind of embody that place of, well, not wanting to change or needing to change. So it's like, then I can see myself kind of retreating from wanting to be an outside force to being more embodied in the being kind of dimension.
So see how beautifully you're actually embracing number 3, but you didn't see it. The number 3 is like the number 3 could be moving into the interior space, so from outside to inside. That's the polarity. You are managing that polarity. You're countering the problem that you're facing by integrating the inside. You're also moving from doing to being, which is another polarity. And you're also freeing yourself from being attached. So you're identified by something, you're freeing yourself. In each of these cases, you can anticipate, if you do too much of being, too much of it's all okay, too much of the body, then you may miss the thing that drew you. And that also has value. So just watch, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, is what I would say.
Yeah.
You see the beauty in that which you are trying to integrate as well.
Yeah, lovely. Just one more comment that comes up for me. I can see this as a journey of being focused outside to becoming more embodied. So and the being more embodied component adds rich experiential value and yeah, the feeling alive sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you too.
Paul, beautiful. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah. I see Anne has a question.
Yeah, and actually, let me ask Anne's question. And this is, I've actually got another question from the community that's sort of related. So what I'll do, Beena, is I'll ask them both, because I think they'll probably receive a somewhat similar answer. So Anne asks, how to trigger interest in polarity for someone who does not see them, especially in a business environment. I don't want to take a position of somebody who, quote, knows what is your problem, which I think is some really great humility there. And it's always difficult when it's like, I have something that I know will serve you, but I don't want to, like, sort of beat you over the head with it. But we had another question that I feel like kind of syncs up with this a little bit, because it's largely a developmental question. Hi, Beena. Does work on polarities assume that we are all rational? Evidence seems to suggest that many people are entrenched in their biases and impervious to rational investigation. How do we overcome people's unconscious biases and prejudices? I'm sure the course will answer that, but I thought I'd put it out there anyway. And that was from a commenter named Phil. So both of these questions are sort of like, okay, I have I'm at whatever altitude I'm at. I can enact polarity thinking the way I do, and I can see it's got a lot of immediate and obvious benefit for me. Will others be able to enjoy the same benefit if they're not necessarily coming from the same sort of structures, developmental structures? So is polarity thinking something that can be used by earlier altitudes? And is it as beneficial for earlier altitudes, or is this something that kind of ripens alongside development?
Yeah, there are many, many different questions in there. And so let me start with Anne's, because I don't necessarily see a developmental level difference there. It's just a question of, if somebody can't see them, how do I tell them that, hey, this is operating? And so my simple answer to that is, maybe people can't see polarities, but everybody feels them. because everybody is subject to them. Everybody is privileging something, having a bias, having a preference, and everybody is sitting on the downside in some way. So they have an experience of this dynamic. They may not name it, they may not be able to see it. And that's something that you can do more skillfully by simply asking questions. You're not telling them that you know what their problem is, because even that I wouldn't do, even if I'm working with somebody and I can sense a polarity that they're struggling with. I would want them to begin to describe their experience and then name it themselves. So I will very rarely say, this is the polarity that's operating in you. So, because when you work with somebody else, you have to follow how they see their experience and how they might name their experience. So the simple thing, Anne, is just follow, ask the questions. If they are over focusing on something, then you can ask a question. Well, when you do too much of this, what are you experiencing? What are some of the downsides? Or what do you think is needed? Or do you want to shift? Or are people asking you to be somebody else? People asking you to focus on something else? And what are you concerned about? What don't you like about the other view? And if you did embrace the other view, what is your fear? So once you understand the 4 quadrants or dimensions that emerge when a polarity is at play, then you can ask the questions very conversationally and the person can get a sense. So that would be my first question is, people can't see them, but everybody feels them. Everybody is in the dynamic because it's a human condition. The second thing is I would tailor the simplicity or the complexity with which I might address what they're going through based on my understanding of their capacity. So if they're very concrete, they're simple, they can't see systems and they can only see either or, black and white, mechanical logic, then I will just be very simple and concrete, and I will want to connect to their experience and look for what they are wanting to solve. But if they are capable of interdependent thinking, they are integrally informed, and they are understanding that they have unconscious world, that they are wanting to become aware of, then I might go into much greater nuance. I might even talk about polarities that happen within you, like intrapersonal polarities. And then there are polarities that show up between people, which would be interpersonal polarities. And then there are other polarities that show up in systems, like structural polarities. So I might go into great nuance and greater complexity based on the level of understanding capacity of the other person. Coming back, so those are the 2 things I wanted to mention to Anne. Now, you had mentioned the question that had come up in, can you just repeat that question that came on the course platform?
Sure. Let's see here. Does work on polarities assume we're all rational? Evidence seems to suggest that many people are entrenched in their biases and impervious to rational investigation. How do we overcome people's unconscious biases and prejudices? I'm sure the course will answer this, but I thought I'd put it out there anyway.
Okay, so how do we overcome unconscious biases and prejudices? My first response is by working on your own. Find out where your unconscious bias is and how do you figure that out. So that would be one. But in terms of, yes, many people are not rational, and they are still effective in some parts of their life because they have applied their mind and they have gotten successful in something or the other. So you want to use what they're already doing and help them see something that they're not quite seeing. And we're all using our thinking capacity to solve problems, to make sense of what is going on, and to achieve a new life or a different world for ourselves and for others. And we can't do that without employing some rationality. So yes, some people may not be applying their rationality in this way, and this is a fantastic way to actually invite them to think about what their unconscious preferences are. And you don't think about them by asking them. You just think about them by looking at what they're experiencing and what is their experience revealing to them about what was unconscious. So that would be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm thinking of, well, I love how what you said about how not everyone sees polarities, but everyone feels them. And I think that's important because that means we all actually interact with these polarities in very, very different
We are
ways according to
subject
our.
to them. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're subject
exactly,
to them.
exactly. And it's interesting to take the perspectives of trying to enact a polarity at the sort of the amber absolutist mind versus the orange multiplistic mind versus the green relativist mind. And then notice that in spiral dynamics, the integral level is the one level where they actually use a polarity to describe the level. It's flex flow. So at each of these stages, you can always feel the polarity, but they're probably going to look a little bit differently. You're going to relate to the two poles a little bit differently, depending on what the overall sort of structure of the overall shape of your mind happens to be. Which is fascinating. And I think that this, it's because it's like, we can do our own work with our polarities, but then when it's time for this to kind of spill out into the world and we share our ideas and we share like, whatever sort of the end result of this polarity process has been for us, that product then can get enacted very, very differently by other people depending on their cosmic address. So these things, these polarities are constantly sort of creating and recreating themselves and recapitulating themselves, and that are enacted in very, very different ways by different people, which makes this, I think, an endlessly fascinating process for us to be engaging with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see, another person from the community asked, when we're filling out the polarity map, do we need to stick with one specific topic?
It's a good question. If this is early in your practice, then I would say yes. It's just simpler to stick with one topic and understand how the dynamic works. Follow one thread. You can elaborate on that thread, but make sure that the central focus is one thing, because it just helps you to see more clearly. And once you get familiar with it, then you can work with 2 or 3 different threads simultaneously. Then you're practiced, and it's much easier for you to grapple with the dynamics between the 1, 2, 3 strands. Just like in Wilber's quadrants, it's not one polarity, but 2. There are 2 topics. One is individual collective, and the other is interior exterior. You overlay one on the other, one over the other, and you have a whole complex world that emerges. So I would say to start off with, yes, practice one, but there's no end. There's no end to the polarities that you can work with.
Yeah, especially when one polarity just sort of naturally leads you to another, which then naturally leads you, and it becomes this whole sort of rabbit hole
just
of
like
compounding polarities.
Yeah, just like we saw with Paul, right on this call, starting with, I want to make my voice heard, but then I want to not have it be that important. So I want to integrate just letting it be. So that's one. And then he also said, well, that also goes into a doing and being polarity, which is another polarity, which is sort of analogous to it, but not quite the same thing. And when you enter a polarity map, or you think about all the dimensions from one particular polarity, and you enter it through another polarity, the field is different, because the content that comes up is different, the context is different, and they both are windows into understanding yourself. They both give you new data about yourself. So more than one is better,
right?
Because it reveals different aspects.
Yep. Jonas asks, I'm seeing regular workplaces as dominated by the masculine polarity, with structure, goals, direction, logical thinking, abstraction, etc. I'm curious how you see how the feminine polarity can enter the regular workplace more. What could be the feminine role? What is needed that the feminine comes with? How could a dance between the two look in a workplace environment? And I'm going to say just right off the bat, it's a tricky question, because there's multiple ways we can enact these ideas of masculine and feminine, right? I mean, there's sort of a, Ken might, for example, describe it as that there's a typology that we can find in all 4 quadrants and all the way up and down. And those typologies each have different qualities. We can also relate to it in a certain kind of way where, these labels of masculine and feminine are actually a set of a number of different sort of qualities coming from a number of polarities. So we often think of, things like eros and agency and objectivity, for example. These are 3 poles from different polarities that are often enacted as masculine, whereas communal and agape and interior subjectivity is often seen as feminine values. So it gets really complicated because we have to sort of carefully define what we mean by masculine and feminine and track whatever sort of other polarities are being smuggled in with those descriptions.
Sure, and we can even keep it at just that simple level also, and just if we just look at as you are describing it, Jonas. So what the question is a very big question because it's a change management question that you're asking. And what I'd like to highlight a couple of things. One is that when polarities are at play, then over time, the system corrects itself, because when you overfocus on one and not the other, the system is vulnerable and it's not sustainable over time. So even if you don't do anything about it, over time, the feminine will get integrated, will get attended to, because the downside of the masculine is so toxic. Similarly, the downside of the feminine is equally toxic. So a system needs to be integrating both. I mean, as you're saying, so what could be the feminine role? What is needed that the feminine comes with? That's a very broad, I would say, an abstract question. It all depends on the context. What kind of feminine aspects are required in that particular context? What kind of workplace is it? What kind of a business is it? What kind of industry is it? And some industries and businesses come with already a particular kind of masculine attention or masculine focus, whereas there might be others that are not. A nonprofit organization that is invested in social service already has a feminine value in its mission itself. So there's so many layers that you may want to consider and think about. So I feel that question about what could be the feminine role is too broad a question. It will depend upon the context. And how could a dance between the two look like? I mean, a dance between the two looks like an integrated organization. So if there are no complaints about it's too soft or it's too harsh, all the qualities, all the downsides of overfocus on masculine, downsides of overfocus on feminine, if there are no complaints, it means it's a healthy organization. And usually it relates to how healthy the leaders in power are, how integrated they are, how much they recognize the feminine values. And sometimes they're not even called feminine values, but there are healthy cultures where both are managed beautifully.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And I think it leads us actually right into the next question. Yeah, I love how you talked about toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. And this is, obviously this is a larger cultural conversation that we've been seeing unfolded and often unfolds in fairly, sometimes harmful ways. I think largely because in our culture, we don't have a polarity understanding of how masculine and feminine works and how either can lapse into healthy or toxic kind of version. So what happens when you don't have that polarity and people keep on repeating words like this is people start interpreting it to mean, oh, so you're saying masculinity is toxic and femininity is good and masculine is bad. And then there's this that creates a reaction, a cultural reaction, which re-entrenches the culture wars and we drift farther and farther away from each other. Whereas polarity reminds us, well, no. Every side of all of these poles has a positive and a negative. And in fact, if we're not putting all of that on the table, then again, we're missing something really, really important about each other. And that's only gonna, perpetuate these sort of political, cultural wars that we're all engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fuzzy thinking, not clear thinking, and it's a product of either or thinking.
Yes.
The either or thinking mindset will say this is bad and that is good, because of course they see the bad, they experience the bad, but they're unable to see the wisdom in the good that led to the bad because the other was being neglected. And so what polarity thinking does is it just expands the situations enough for you to see there's the beautiful masculine and there's the beautiful feminine. And if you focus only on the beautiful masculine and don't integrate the feminine, it becomes toxic.
Right.
And if you focus only on the beautiful feminine and don't integrate the masculine, that becomes toxic. So there are two kinds of toxicities and there are two kinds of wisdom in connection with the yin and the yang.
And this is so important for us to remember as we sort of, again, navigate the world around us, is that, it's really, really easy to fall into the trap where we are comparing the negative version of one pole to the positive version of another pole. Right. And then it just looks like good versus bad, for example. And we have to remind ourselves, we have to train ourselves to enact this in a fuller way. Which again, I think leads us to this next question. I am involved with diversity, equity, and inclusion in my professional society. The minorities want to talk a lot about unconscious bias causing systemic racism. Somehow, I don't think that they want to talk about their own biases. They just talk about white privilege bias. Are there any thoughts about how to approach the other pole with them?
Yeah, this is very, very tricky. And there's so many layers in this. I'm going to point you actually to Byron Katie's work. And she just did, and I can put the link, I'll look for it in a moment, and I can put the link in the chat box, where she is asking 4 basic questions, which is what she calls the inquiry method, with somebody who's working with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who is struggling with others who don't even see color, and or who are only wanting to talk about the white privilege and not about their own. So I'm going to point you to that. Simply, I feel you'll get a lot out of that, much more than I could answer actually, in a few minutes here. But the main thing that I would add is for us to begin to own our unconscious biases while we are working with others as well.
Yeah,
that would be my response.
Yeah. And it's a great example, because I do oftentimes see these conversations getting sort of stuck on one pole or another. One of the things, for example, in the debates around critical race theory, which, just to be clear, I'm not hostile at all to critical race theory. I've got some issues with some of the prescriptions, but I think they're uncovering a lot of really important partial truths that need to be put on the table and better managed. But an example here is that, in the core critical race theory literature, they look at qualities such as objectivity and neutrality, which they enact as sort of being a negative. And so there's an explicit attempt to go to the other pole of, well, no, instead of being, pretending that we're objective, we need to allow ourselves to be subjective. And instead of pretending to be neutral, we need to allow for, political advocacy, for example. That needs to become more sort of central. And they're obviously, what they're doing is they're compensating for one pole with another pole, but they're not taking that next step of integrating and harmonizing that polarity itself, where we can see, okay, if we do too much objectivity and we lose track of the subjectivity, here's sort of, the negatives that can fall out of that. And vice versa. And I think what we'd like to see is a more integral conversation that's capable of identifying and pulling all of these different poles together into something that's far more coherent than any sort of these theories that we've seen so far.
Yeah, thank you. I found the one that I was looking for, and I'm going to put that in the chat box. It's called I Too Am a Racist. Let me see, where would I put that, in the chat box, or I just put it in the chat box for everyone.
There you go.
Yeah.
Beth asks, I fear this is too basic of a question. No such thing, Beth. I'm new to this topic, and I'm concerned that I am so entrenched in my personal polarities that I don't even have any idea that there's another pole. Is there a list of polarities somewhere so I could start considering how to identify the places, other options that I have not been conscious of yet? I love the question.
Absolutely. Yes. So there are lists and lists that I can send to you, Corey, if you want to post it. How do we post the material?
Well, whatever you send me, once this actually goes up on Integral Life, I'll post it right down there on the page. In the meantime, we can share things in the chat. Beth, I also just want to mention, right now on Integral Life, we're selling Beena's Polarity training for Integral Life members anyway for $50. So we're intentionally keeping this very, very, very low price, because we want as many of you guys to be able to participate with this training and to benefit from it, so that we can help sort of bring more sanity and stability to the world. So I would definitely invite you to check out the actual training if you haven't, which again, we've intentionally made very, very affordable to as many people as possible.
And the lists are available in the course as material, just
That's
so
right.
you know. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But some maybe we can just kind of riff on some of them right now. I mean, at least the ones, again, that integral makes explicit. You have, you know, interior and exterior. You have individual and collective. We have part and whole. We have time and the timeless, or temporal and atemporal. We have form and emptiness, agency and communion, eros and agape. Geez.
So I'm gonna pause here and say that that whole list was what I might conceptual polarities that you can, you know, begin to look at. And based on experiential polarities, I'm going to look at the list that people came up with earlier, right here.
Awesome.
So I'm looking at people who said honesty. So honesty is one pole. You want to be really honest, but what if you're too honest? What is that other thing? So being tactful, because you can, you know, some people say, I don't care. I believe in honesty and I'm brutally honest and, you know, take it or leave it. And that is actually can get dysfunctional. So you want to be honest, but you also want to take care of the impact on the other person. So you want to be honest and you want to be caring. So brutally honest is not going to get you the benefit that honesty can bring you if you do too much of it, or if you do it in the wrong way. So being honest and being caring, that's a polarity. Cheryl says, I'm curious. What happens when you're too curious? What are some of the downsides? And then, so what would be the other sides? I need to be focused. I'm too curious. I'm all over the place. I would like to be focused. So being curious, being focused, that's another polarity. So I would like you to go down the list and look at, you can see all the values that people love. And then what happens when they overdo it and what they yearn for, which is the other pole. And you have, I think we can name 20 polarities right here, Beth, on the list. And if you learn how to see the other pole, then you can get more skilled at noticing polarities.
One of them that's been really foregrounded for me recently, in fact, we did an entire episode about it a couple of weeks ago, is the polarity between confidence and humility. Being able to generate a genuine, confident humility in terms of how we move through this world. That really presented itself as a critical polarity for me. So I've been doing a lot of work with that one.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking at Luba Balo's question. It's a long question.
Shall I read it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I once had a phase where I was doing polarity management map on a paper, but recently I've done it on a program, like a document program, and it served me well in my career. But now I've been hesitant with drawing it on paper and filling out the paper. However, I know, see, and feel that I have polarities with the schedule being squeezed in some personal relationships, wanting to be work relationships again, that are somehow seen to force themselves back in this holiday. But I'm sorry, I'm having a little, I think we might having a bit of a language
no, that's
issue with this
okay.
one.
But I'm sort of a good space when I don't have these relationships which were once toxic or felt toxic. So there's this tension between do I focus more on these relationships, or you know, I feel like I don't want to reclaim relationships that were toxic. So I can understand what you're saying. But your main question is that you want to continue training. Can I also do it on paper? Of course, you can do it on paper. I find that if you keep the rigor of doing the polarity map on paper a little bit in the beginning and you get familiar, then you can do it without the paper as well. So I would just say, I would like you to practice until you feel you're skilled at it. And I mean, you said you've been working on the maps and you can feel the polarities. So I think you should trust yourself. And when you feel like you're not quite there or you don't understand, then go back to paper. But I would say do both. You know, it's a polarity. You know, sometimes it's good to take the template, print it out, write it out and work with yourself. And sometimes, you know, you can work with the polarity over a month, you know, just exploring the wisdom of one and getting familiar with what happens when you tend to overdo it. Begin to explore what would it look like to explore, you know, to embrace the other side. You could just stretch it out and not put it on paper as well. So I'm saying trust yourself and just continue to practice.
I'm sorry I lost the thread while I was reading that, and thank you, Beena, for picking the thread up again.
Yeah, that's okay.
Looks like Eric Troff has his hand raised, so let's bring
Oh,
you on
Eric.
over.
Eric is an old friend. Hi, Eric.
Hey, Eric, how are
Okay,
you?
I think I'm here. I miss anything you said from the time you promoted me because it just sort of pops me out of Zoom for a moment. So, hi Beena, hi Corey, good to
Hi,
be with
Eric.
you.
Good to see
Good
you.
to see you. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question I have is a little complex, and so one thing I want to set is like an overall concept, overall framework for polarities, and how do we distinguish those things that are, and polarities are everywhere. You're talking about that, but there's also things that are not polarities. And how do we distinguish, the problems to be solved from polarities to be managed, and also to not get drawn into things that are not really polarities per se, that we can maybe get sucked into, and we put them in that framework. And so, a common example has been used like, to go to restaurant A or restaurant B. Yeah, there's pluses and there's minuses, but it's not something that's enduring. It's not a tension between two things. So now what I want to do is, take that into culture wars in the U.S. where I live, and hopefully this is relevant to others because I think these political divides are something that's more than just our country. Being around this community of integral, I'm great with the stuff of like there's this tension between liberalism and conservatism, and we hold that as a polarity, and that there's values of both sides. And like I'm great with that. When it comes to as someone who's a leader, being transparent, or maybe being a little bit more guarded. You brought up honesty a moment ago. Yeah, there's something to that somebody who's totally transparent is going to hit the downsides of that. Somebody who's too secretive and guarded is going to hit the downsides of that. So I'm good with the polarities generally, but there's a place where I come up with a boundary between like truth and falsehood. And by that, I mean intentional falsehood. For instance, there's a lot of conspiracy making and things like that. And it has a major impact. I can grant that, maybe half of a country, for instance, has a different political persuasion. Yeah, okay, fine with that. But right now we have a situation in this country where, half or more of one of the major political parties in our country believes that the current president was not legitimately elected and is falsely occupying a seat in the Oval Office. And that's based on a lot of things that there's a lot of evidence that would say that's based on a bunch of falsehoods. That's a real problem for how our society functions. So the kind of question that I have is like, how does someone who's, we'll call it the polarity wizard, playing off of, spiral wizards and so forth, what does the polarity wizard's approach to dealing with these cultural dynamics of how to, acknowledge the truths of different points of view, and at the same time not fall into some of these things that are just manufactured falsehoods to further certain agendas in a way that I personally believe is harmful to our society. So there
Yeah,
it is.
it's not easy. It's tricky, and it's like you said, it's complex. And I mean, there's so many different layers of responses. So for me, I'll just speak personally that when I feel that there is falsehood there, I will be very clear and say, I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's true. And I would look for evidence. And I don't hesitate to be in an either or mindset if I have enough logic, if I have enough evidence. But that doesn't take away from the fact that different people have their different perspectives. And when it comes to conspiracy theories, I mean, again, there are so many layers of judgment. There's the factual part, then there's the cultural, social part that becomes a thing in and of itself, because you're then thinking about the collective, and the collective becomes one person, as if it's one thought. And so we end up mixing up by using monolithic thinking in some ways. And ultimately, the whole idea of conspiracy theorists, I mean, for me, I'm looking at it at the level of mind and ego development. And I think every time I make up a story of what somebody did to me, I'm a conspiracy theorist. So what I tend to do is when I am, the moment I begin to complain or project what somebody else is doing, I tend to turn it around and ask myself, how am I doing that same thing? It helps me deal with the situation. It helps me integrate. It helps me see how I am dividing the world into black or white. It helps me see how I am using monolithic thinking. So there are so many layers, and all of those are true. You know, there's a place for polarities, there's a place for no polarities, there is a place for either or. There's a place for evidence, then there's a place for my own filters and biases. And then I think about, how does that impact my relationship with people? How does that impact my relationship with my neighbor? Who am I with my neighbor if my neighbor is holding this view that I don't agree with? So that's a whole other layer of exploration of how do I show up? Who can I be with this human being right now in this moment? So those are all the little thoughts that I have about the complex situation. And I'm with you, Eric. I mean, it's confounding and it's compounding.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
don't think
Yeah.
there is I don't think there is a high level sort of a conclusive, sort of a response to that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you shedding more light on that. And I think the personal aspect I know is something that I'm working with. So in my little town in Montana, one of the people who recently ran for our city council a couple of weeks ago was someone who was very into the QAnon stuff and had been one of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And so, I had this thing of like, how do I deal with this person who has the appliance store with all these QAnon themes, painted all over the sides of the store, who was, running for city council? And I was like, wow, that was a real challenge. And for me to, get to that place of like, can I not put this person out of my heart? Can I appreciate, that they have good intentions? I think they're misinformed, but, I can find that place of like, oh, appreciating the goodness in this person. It means well. I disagree. But then, there's also the invitation for me implicit in that, like, am I willing to engage with someone like that rather than hold them at arm's length and go like, oh, that crazy person there. But, am I willing to do that? How much, whether that's a worthy investment of my time is another question. But, I think to come over that hurdle of my fearfulness of someone who holds that kind of view and is willing to take up arms and, kill other people to, promote their point of view, that's a real challenging one for me, so.
So one of the corners that I've turned as I've continued to think about this and try to navigate through it is how I agree with you that something like fact versus fiction, that's not a polarity, right? That's clearly not a polarity. And when it comes to like people believing that JFK Jr. is going to come back from the dead and reinstate Donald Trump, which is, a contemporary QAnon thought that's out there. It's like, okay, I can't integrate with that. I can't put that on a map and find any way to, include that in a healthy polarity. But when I dig a little bit deeper and I remind myself that sometimes what appears to be fact versus fiction is actually coming from another polarity of like orthodox versus heterodox in terms of sources of information, I think this is where maybe the conversation gets a little bit more interesting, because we begin to realize that some of the things that we call conspiracy theory, some of them is a matter of fact versus fiction, right? Such as the JFK thing. Other times it's just a matter of what sources is this coming through? Is this coming through an orthodox point of view, or is it coming through a heterodox point of view? And oftentimes, we know that some conspiracies, we know that oil companies paid researchers to deny climate change. That's a conspiracy. That's a real conspiracy. And until it was proven, it was a conspiracy theory that was oftentimes only seen through heterodox sources of information. So for me, like just kind of making a space for that, just to be like, okay, this isn't necessarily, this very well could fall into a sort of fact or fiction binary where I can write off the fiction and I want to stick with the facts. Other times there's another perspective in there that wants to emerge, which is simply, I'm enacting this information from a different kind of constellation of media sources. And maybe it gets a little bit easier for us to make room for it if we relate to it in that way. So that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. I appreciate that. And it makes sense to me because many conspiracy theories do have a kernel of truth in the beginning of it, and then they look and they dig into things, and it's been helpful in many, because many conspiracies have proven to be true. I think, part of the difference and the differentiation that I would like to make is between something that takes that kernel of truth and then spins it into something else with the intentional layering, because I think there's a lot of that going on, not only within country but also geopolitically. We look at the big players and what kind of foreign sources of disinformation have an agenda to create division and promote those. So it gets incredibly complex when we add those layers of intentionally disinforming people. That's a hard one to find our way out of, unfortunately.
It's a big question. I mean, I see this as being like one of the central life conditions of our time that is just begging for integral solutions. I don't think any of us know what those solutions look like quite yet, but something is going to emerge. These are all the right problems for us to be having at this time, I think.
Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, yeah, and begging for integral solutions, and also coming back to what you'd said earlier to Beena about, how can I, relate to these people with different views as people and really see their humanity and appreciate that, they're trying to make sense of a complex world just the same way I am, and that it goes all the way up and all the way down, and whatever my altitude, there's still a whole lot of levels of altitude above me too.
Yeah, and that's the polarity, is the idea and the person. Am I only paying attention to their ideas, to their thoughts, to their beliefs, and then completely disregarding the person? I mean, would I kill them for their ideas? And I kill them. I mean, I may not actually pick up a gun and shoot them, but I'm killing them in my mind. They don't exist. They need to be exterminated. How can we do away with them? We all have these thoughts and feelings. And so one of the ways to look at how does polarity thinking apply here is, am I paying attention to the person? Am I paying attention, like you said, to their humanity? Can I begin to understand how they got there? How orienting is their worldview to them? Just like I have a worldview that's orienting to me. I'm not necessarily saying relativize everything, but I'm saying that can I consider that? And especially if today is the only day we have, we don't know if we're going to wake up tomorrow morning. 1 million people don't wake up every morning.
Yeah.
And if this is the only day I have with this human being, who am I going to be with this human being?
Yeah. I feel moved as I listen to what you're saying, Beena, because it's like, it's easy to think in some ways of like, oh, I'm just attacking an idea, not a person. But at the same time, that idea fits within a whole worldview that gives coherence to their life. And if I pull the rug out from under them, there's a violence in that as well, and that I have to respect. They are where they are, that this gives them meaning and purpose, and to be really mindful of how I approach that, and not just say like, well, that's factually wrong. It's like,
Right.
well, maybe it is, but does that really serve the interaction what I'm having? So, yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate this. Has been very wonderful to talk with the two of you.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you, Eric.
The other little wrinkle I'll add on to there that's helped me with this, because it has been my experience that sometimes sometimes our worldviews are not compatible, and they cannot be made compatible. Sometimes there are just mutually exclusive views that do not fit together, and I think there's an okayness with that. And for me, that whenever I feel like that's happening, I try to take it as an invitation to take one step further and not just stay in the realm of conflicting views, but try to try to access the underlying values that are animating those views in the first place. Because oftentimes the views that we most vehemently disagree with, they're coming from a value that we can really resonate with. Some of these, crazy QAnon views that are out there, for example, are really just coming from a place of fear, a place, they're coming from places that all of us can relate with in various ways. And these sort of core emotions get enacted in very different ways for different groups of people who are in different regions of the country and have different access to information and blah, 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 blah. But the value that is actually driving those views in the first place, I think that's where we can find a lot of resonance with each other. And I think that's where a lot of this polarity work can become even more valuable as a tool that we can use to better see each other, and hopefully to get sort of beneath some of those views, because, my experience is that these days we are just over identifying with with our views, and we're not really leveraging our own inner values as much as we could and probably should be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we only have a few minutes left. Corey, what would you like to, I think there is a comment, not a question, so that's good to have. And has a comment here. I don't understand Marilyn's question, so.
Oh, since when is fear a value? I was inelegant when I was speaking, Marilyn, and I was saying oftentimes our views are animated by our values. Sometimes our values are in response to an emotion like fear. I'm not saying fear is a value, but I'm saying fear can trigger our values and can trigger various responses depending on what our values are. And I think that is the opportunity for us to more closely connect with each other and align ourselves with each other. Other than that, I'm wondering if does anyone have any final questions? Let me look at the Q&A real quick.
Yeah, I'd invite you to work a little bit more with polarities, take the course or just read up. There's lots of literature out there. And I find that it's a fundamental lens for making sense in ways that are more integral, in ways that are integrative. And I think it reduces suffering and brings clarity. So that would be my sort of summary statement, it allows us to be clearer and kinder, and it reduces the pain individually and collectively. So
beautiful. Beautiful. Well, again, I want to close just by inviting everyone who's watched right now, go to integrallife.com, click the courses button, and check out the Integrating Polarities training. This is, it's truly extraordinary training. Again, one of the things that I love about the course as you formulated it, Beena, is, I think that for a long time, we've been looking for sort of a way to teach integral thinking, sort of the way critical thinking is taught in high schools and universities around the country. How can we systematize integral thinking and teach it to people, right? And I think that you have sort of cracked the code here. I think that, whenever I'm suggesting integral ideas, especially for newcomers, I tend to start with polarity thinking, because I think this formats the hard drive for all the information that's about to get dumped there. It helps you understand, better navigate, and better internalize all of these big, beautiful ideas that are floating around there in integral land. So I invite all of you guys to please check out the training. And then I just wanted to read a comment real briefly from our community. This person says, this course has been extremely helpful and even transformative for me. I came to Integral Life with deeply painful binary questions, and this course has untangled the two-headed snake. Thank you so much for the clarity and wisdom of the course and your engaging and perceptive presence. And Beena, I want to extend that thanks to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to answer these questions and to hang out with our audience and to hang out with me. And this has just been so much fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Corey, for the invitation. And I find that polarity thinking has made me more human, more appreciative, more affirming. And so, yeah, I invite all of you to play. It's endlessly, it's like the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah. So thank you for this and opportunity. Great to meet everybody. I found a very interesting question by Clinton, which we didn't have time to get to. So Clinton, you can email me at beena@verticaldevelopment.com. This is about ego death and the Buddhist idea about, ego dying. And so where does polarity come in? It's a very beautiful question and too big in some ways to tackle here. So if you want to write to me, I'm happy to chat with you. So.
And just to let people know too, we are going to follow up this program with another one just for those of you who have enrolled in Integrating Polarities. So we're going to do another one of these webinars with students of that course. So maybe that's a question that we can bring into that discussion, Beena.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And I look forward to seeing you all again and hang out with you, Corey.
Yes,
Thanks
absolutely.
For your partnership and supporting this effort.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Beena. I love you so much. And thank you everyone who has watched us from home today. And we hope to see you next time.
Yeah, bye for now. Bye, everyone.